The smoke had not yet lifted from Jerusalem when the young men were brought before the lords of Babylon. Night lay heavy over the ruined city. The temple courts were stilled, the sound of lament still clinging to the stones. From the city gate to the river they were led, a small procession of the chosen, noble in bearing, though stripped of home, each face a map of grief and resolve. Among them was Daniel, whose name in Judah had carried the quiet steadiness of prayer. Now he would learn the art of standing where empires watch. If you will stay until the end, subscribe and activate notifications to receive more narrations like this. And if this account bears on your heart, take a moment to like and leave a word that the Lord may use. They were arrayed in the palace as if in a dream of another world. Young men of royal seed were given learning and language, clothed in Babylon's colors, given new names to fit new courts. Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. The dishes set before them were ornate. Spices and breads filled the courtyard with unfamiliar scents. Yet Daniel resolved in his heart not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine of his table. He asked permission with measured words, and the steward, wary of the will of those who appointed him, granted a trial. 10 days of pulse and water, and then the proof would be plain. The 10 days passed like a small season of testing. The young men grew in health and countenance upon the simple fare, and their faces showed favor in the eyes of the steward and in the council of the king's wise men. Daniel and his friends did not bend their faith to convenience. Instead, they revealed that steadfastness lends clarity to the mind. When the king set before his wise men a dream that troubled his sleep, none could disclose it. They spoke of visions and signs, of wise men who read stars and burnt offerings, but the secret lay hidden, and the king's wrath rose like an oven. It was then that Daniel stepped forth, not with the arrogance of one who commands the winds, but with the quiet assurance of one who had sought the Lord in the night. He asked for time and gathered his companions to petition the God of heaven. On their knees they poured out the plea that would shape the fate of nations. In the hush of that prayer, God revealed the secret of the dream and its meaning. Daniel returned to the king and spoke. The image of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay represented a succession of kingdoms, mighty, then broken, until a stone cut without hands smote the feet and grew into a mountain, the whole earth, God's kingdom, everlasting and not of human making. Nebuchadnezzar rose and acknowledged a wisdom not born of Babylon's books, and Daniel was set over the wise men, his name honored, his people quietly remembered in the ordinances of a foreign court. The furnace burned before the city like a tongue of flame. Nebuchadnezzar, lifted by pride, made an image of gold and commanded every voice to call it God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused. Their refusal was not the rashness of youth, but the conviction of hearts that had seen their God stand when others failed. They were cast into the furnace. The heat turned savage at the king's command. But the king, watching, saw not 3 but 4 walking amid the flames, and the 4th as one like a son of the gods. No hair was singed, no smell of smoke clinging to their robes. The monarch, undone and trembling, proclaimed the power of their God. Judgment and mercy danced before the assembled governors, a spectacle for the proud, a vindication for the faithful. Time in Babylon wore different upon the great king. Nebuchadnezzar, after the glory of his victories, dreamed again. This time his vision was of a lofty tree, its height touching heaven, its fruit feeding all creatures, its shade a refuge for birds. An angelic voice declared a reversal. The tree would be cut down, and the man who had boasted would be driven from men, until he acknowledges that the Most High rules over the realm of humankind. The sentence fell heavy, and the king's mind was wrestled with a madness that humbled him to the fields. Yet, in the cool of eventual repentance, his reason restored, he lifted his voice in praise. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven. The court, who had trembled to see kingship laid low, now saw a confession rise loud as trumpets. Between crowns and fall came feasts of arrogance. Belshazzar, clothed in the decadence of a royal house grown careless, stole the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem and drank wine in their profane light. In the midst of the banquet, a hand appeared and wrote on the plastered wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. The wise men fell silent. The king trembled. Daniel, summoned in the last hour, stood and read the inscription. God had numbered the days of the kingdom and brought it to an end. The king had been weighed and found wanting. The kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night the city fell, Darius the Mede taking the citadel, the empire turning in God's unseen hands as a potter turns a jar. Daniel's life in the new regime bore other trials. Under Darius, when men, jealous of Daniel's favor, set law against him, the old test of faith returned in a new garb. They persuaded Darius to sign a decree that no petition should be made to any god or man but to the king for 30 days. Daniel, who had his window open toward Jerusalem, returned to the old habit of prayer. Twice and thrice a day he bowed and gave thanks. For this he was cast into the lion's den. The stone sealed the mouth of the den, and Darius, grieving, watched through the night. At dawn his voice called, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to deliver you? Daniel answered, unharmed, and the king rejoiced, delivering judgment upon the conspirators and setting Daniel in a place of renewed honor. But of all the nights that shaped the life of Daniel, none compared to those where the heavens were opened and the great visions took hold. In dreams and waking revelations, Daniel saw beasts rise from the sea. Each beast bore dominion, each horn a power that would blaspheme and oppress. He beheld the Ancient of Days taking his seat, the court assembled, thrones set, books opened. The beasts lost their dominion, judgment sat. The skies bore a figure like a son of man, who came near the Ancient of Days, and was given everlasting dominion. Daniel understood then that earthly kingdoms are but shadows before the eternal reign God prepares. He wrote with trembling ink of one who would receive an everlasting kingdom, a deliverance not born of human arms, but of the will of God. In another hour, on the banks where the Euphrates flowed slow and wide, Daniel saw a ram with 2 horns, pushing westward, northward, and southward. Yet came a goat from the west with a notable horn. The goat struck and broke the ram's horns. Then a small horn grew, speaking great things, and casting down the sanctuary. The vision spoke of wars and rulers, of an arrogance that would defile the sanctuary, and of a time when the power of oppression would be met by the purging of the sanctuary.
Daniel heard, too, of a period of days and evenings, of the trampling and the cleansing, seasons that would test the covenant people. When the weight of visions pressed upon him, Daniel set himself to fasting and mourning. He sought the Lord with sackcloth upon his loins and ashes upon his head. In those long vigils, he received another revelation. An angelic messenger, radiant and resplendent, explained what lay under the symbols. Angels contending with the princes of Persia and Greece, Michael standing as a great prince for the people. The messenger's words were not merely history, but prophecy. Times would be set, kings would rise and fall, and at the appointed season, God would fulfill his purpose. Daniel fell prostrate. His limbs shook, and he was given strength. Yet the revelation came with a command to seal the words until the time of the end, leaving Daniel as a watchman who sees but must wait. There was within Daniel a tenderness often hidden by the armor of wisdom. He carried the grief of his people like a wound that refused to heal. And in the year of his vision, he turned to confession and supplication on their behalf. He read the scrolls of the prophets, remembered Jeremiah's word of 70 years, and he set his face to seek the Lord with fasting and confession. In prayer, he spoke on behalf of his nation with a voice that echoed the ancient penitent. "We have sinned, we have turned aside." He pleaded for the city and its people, recognizing that exile was not merely the movement of armies, but the justice of a holy God.
A síntese de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Overwhelmment of armies, but the justice of a holy God." Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. And as he prayed, Gabriel came to give him insight and to bring words of comfort. The 70 weeks were decreed for the restoration of righteousness and to anoint the Holy of Holies. Yet the path to restoration would pass through the coming of an anointed one, a suffering and a final consummation. Throughout Daniel's visions ran symbolic images that later ages would read as prophecies of the Messiah. The stone cut without hands, the Son of Man presented before the Ancient of Days, the promise of an everlasting kingdom. These were not esoteric puzzles for the learned alone, but signals of a divine plan that pierced time. The narrator pauses here, not to invent beyond the text, but to draw the line. What Daniel saw was not the triumph of nation over nation, but the fidelity of God to his purpose, and that ultimate purpose finds its center in the reign of one who succeeds where empires fail. And yet, while the vision soared, the world below kept its petty cruelties. Kings were proud, councils whispered, plots were laid. Daniel, wise and yet still a man of the flesh, faced slanders and envy. The court's cunning men, unable to match his standing with the rulers, conspired to bind the law and trap him. Their instruments were laws signed and seals affixed. Their hearts revealed the age-old craft of men who would set human decrees above the justice of heaven. The Lord, however, used such traps to expose the limits of human power and to highlight the truth that God preserves his servants in the midst of political winds. When Daniel spoke to kings, he always did so without flattery. He reminded them that their thrones were but temporary and that their fortunes were beneath the sovereignty of the Lord Most High. To Nebuchadnezzar he said, after the humbling of the tree, that man must learn who gives breath and sets the measure of a kingdom.
To Darius he gave counsel that would endure. A king's law can bind men, but God's providence binds kingdoms. Daniel's words, sober and unadorned, carried the weight of one who had seen both the fragility of empires and the unshaken steadiness of God. In the court and in the visions, angels moved with a solemn authority. Gabriel came to explain, Michael stood as protector. Daniel saw them as figures not of myth, but of service, messengers and princes commissioned by God to fulfill purposes in the unseen. Once, when an angel came to him, the messenger's appearance was like lightning, and his voice like the noise of a multitude. He laid hands upon Daniel and strengthened him, saying that, though he had stood in the service of God, the prince of Persia had resisted until another prince came. Thus, Daniel learned that the affairs of nations have a spiritual dimension. There are princes of this world who oppose the liberty God brings, and angels employed by God to fulfill divine decrees. As the sequence of visions unfolded, they formed a tapestry of hope and warning.
4 beasts rose like storm clouds. Each beast gave way to another, each a stage of human dominion corrupted by pride. Yet the Ancient of Days sat in judgment, and the Son of Man received a kingdom that would not be taken by brute force, but given and sustained by God's decree. Daniel beheld the end of tyrannies in the light of a coming deliverance. He was made to see that history moves toward a restoration that is both judicial and redemptive. There were moments when Daniel's loneliness bent him low. He had no sons at his side. His companions had their own paths. He watched funerals and triumphs, unmoored from his native city, which lay under strangers' tread. In such hours, he walked to the riverbanks and lifted his face to the stars, asking for wisdom and for his people's return. Yet it is precisely in that solitude that his faith was refined, a tenderness for his nation entwined with a theology of hope. He learned to wait without bitterness, to intercede without presumption, to trust without visible confirmation. The prophetic images did not end as private wonders. They were written, sealed, and then set before the people as a lamp in dark places. Daniel's words became a voice in later generations. Priests read them, teachers pondered them, and the faithful saw in the Son of Man a figure whose dominion would eclipse the ephemeral might of kings. The stone cut without hands became, for those who read with faith, the emblem of a kingdom that cannot be toppled by human rebellion. The 70 weeks provoked both hope and urgent searching, for they pointed toward a culmination that would involve an anointed one, both brought low and vindicated. Amid the grandeur of visions and the cruelty of courts, there came the pastoral notes, the strings that draw the narrative to application. What is the reader to learn from Daniel's waiting and from the deliverances he witnessed? First, that God's sovereignty is not an abstract doctrine, but a present reality that shapes history. Empires rise and fall, kings boast and are humbled, but God's counsel stands. Second, that faithfulness under pressure is a testimony that moves hearts. The refusal of Daniel and his friends to bow before idols, their prayer despite decrees, and their integrity in service became a witness that led even pagan rulers to trembling confession. Third, that prophecy points beyond itself to the hope of a consummation in which God will set his people free, not merely politically, but in the deepest sense of covenant restoration. There is a tenderness in the text for those who wait. Daniel's visions offer not the comfort of easy answers, but the steadying conviction that God is at work in times of exile and humiliation. When one loves a homeland as Daniel loved Jerusalem, the seasons of absence bruise,
Yet those seasons are not meaningless. They are instruments in God's hand to refine faith and to prepare a people for the promises still to be fulfilled.
In the hush after a vision, Daniel often fell to his face. He asked for understanding, for mercy, and for the coming of the one who would establish righteousness. His prayers were not mere petitions, but confessions of dependence. He cried out on behalf of the people, "Let your mercy revive what your justice has corrected." In those prayers, the voice of a faithful servant calls us to examine our own life. Where are we tempted to accommodate the world for the sake of comfort? Where do we bow inwardly to the idols of prestige or security? To you who hear this account, consider the posture of Daniel. He did not seize power by cunning. He refused to sin for safety. He did not withhold prayer in the face of decree. He did not speak only to be heard by men, but to be faithful to the one who sees in secret. If you are tempted to compromise where principle and faith intersect, remember the furnace and the den. Faithfulness may bring threat, but God's presence goes with those who are faithful. If you feel the weight of nations in your own life, pressures to conform to systems contrary to God, hold fast to prayer and to integrity. The narrative's climax is not a single miracle, though miracles abound. It is the vision of the eternal courtroom and the Son of Man given dominion. In that scene, every temporal power is placed in perspective. The beasts lose their authority. The court sits. The books are opened. It is a theological summit where justice and mercy meet, where the oppressed find vindication, and where the faithful are promised their inheritance. Daniel, whose days had been filled with exile, interpreter's labor, and quiet intercession, saw there not only the judgment of nations, but the promise of resurrection and restoration. He was told that many who sleep in the dust shall awake to everlasting life or shame, a language that would comfort the faithful in ages to come. Yet Daniel's role remained humble, to witness, to write, to seal. He was a prophet who saw far, but often had to bind the words until the appointed season. There is a discipline in such waiting, to hold revealed truth without forcing its fulfillment, to live in hope without fabricating signs. Daniel exemplified patience born of trust. His life teaches that revelation without endurance births confusion. Endurance without revelation risks despair. As the years accumulated, the courts changed hands, and the empires shifted like garments. Cyrus rose and issued a decree that allowed the exiles to return and to rebuild the temple. The movement of kings was like a great river guided by unseen hand. Daniel's contemporary world, marked by capture and court, fire and den, vision and judgment, thus points forward. The stone that crushed the Iron Kingdom foreshadowed a king whose rule is not of conquest, but of consummation. The Son of Man who stands before the Ancient of Days is a title that echoes through the ages and finds its fullness in the one who bore suffering and yet was vindicated. In closing, the narrative seeks to leave the listener not only informed, but formed. Daniel's life urges steadfastness, prayer, and a refusal to let the seductions of power dilute devotion. The prophetic images invite us not to speculation alone, but to trust. God governs history and will bring about what He has decreed. The messenger angels who contended with princes remind us that spiritual realities undergird earthly events, and Michael's presence assures those who stand for God's people that they are not left alone. Now, before the final exhortation, a short pastoral appeal. If the faithfulness of Daniel stirs you, take one step this week toward courage. Speak truth to power in a small, faithful way. Return to a discipline of prayer, or quietly act for the good of those the world forgets. If you have been sustained in hardship, write Amen below and share a brief testimony so others may be encouraged. And if these words have been a lamp to your path, subscribe and activate notifications to continue walking together. Your sharing helps others find this message. Let us bow in a brief prayer of confession and petition modeled on Daniel's own heart. Almighty God, we acknowledge our failures and the ways we have bowed to lesser powers. Have mercy. Restore what is right. Grant us courage to remain faithful in small things. Make us instruments of your peace and witnesses to your sovereign rule. In the shelter of your presence, give us endurance until the day when every kingdom yields to your everlasting reign. The night closes upon the palace and the plain, and yet the visions cast a strange and steady light. Daniel, an old man perhaps, stands again at his window, looking toward the city of his youth. He has seen kings rise, he has seen the Lord act in marvelous ways. He waits, not idle, but with a hope that trembles like a lamp in the wind, steady, unconsumed. The reader is left at that window too, invited to watch the slow movement of God's purposes and to answer the call to faithfulness where one stands. He turned from the window and took up his writing. The visions that had come like thunder and like dawn, he set down with hands grown steady in their tremor. Some words he penned plainly, other words he wrote with marks that would hide their fullness until the time appointed. For it was told him that many things were for the latter days, and that the wise would turn them to understanding when their season came. By day he moved among the men of the court with the reverence of one who had learned that greatness is humbly born. He gave counsel to governors and to captains of the household, and he entreated mercy for those who were oppressed. At times he withdrew to the quiet of his chamber and bent the knee. At times he walked the fields outside the city and called upon the Lord with a voice like an old harp plucked by patient fingers.
His discipline did not fade with age. He continued to seek the God of heaven, to confess the sins he had seen in his own heart and in the hearts of the people, to beseech that justice would roll on like a mighty river. Many came to him for judgment, and his words were seasoned by fear of the Lord. He would not be bribed, nor would he flatter princes in their pride. He spoke truth when it was wise to speak, and held silence when prudence commanded restraint. Thus he kept the balance of a servant in a strange land, faithful to his God, respectful to those in authority, faithful also to the suffering of his kinsmen. The Lord gave him favor before men, and wisdom in counsel, even as he continued to long for the city of his fathers, and for the house that lay in ruin. In his loneliness he remembered the angels. He remembered the contests unseen, the messenger who came with tidings and with restraint, the prince who strove on behalf of Israel. These things taught him that the battles for right were not only of sword and statute, but of truth that moves through the heavens and through the courts of time. When enemies rose in splendor, he would lift his heart and say, "The Lord knows, and his decree shall stand." When the halls of power glittered with false security, he would say, "Yet the Ancient of Days abides, and his throne is steadfast." There came seasons of sorrow. Plagues and famines touched the land about him. A king's whim brought ruin to the house of a neighbor. A harvest failed, and the poor were pressed. Daniel wept in the night for those things. He fasted and prayed, not to change God's counsel, but to be found faithful within it. His lament was a lamp within the darkness. It did not pretend to hurry the Lord, but it kept his own heart from hardening. And there were days of joy amid trial. Men were spared when calamity stood at their gates. Captives returned upon the wind of a king's favor. The altar of the Lord was lifted in the land again, and the prayers of the faithful rose like incense.
Daniel praised in these days and taught others to praise. He would gather the young and set before them the histories of their people, recalling the Lord's hand in deliverance, so that hope might be born anew in those who would one day lead. He wrote of kingdoms as stones and metals, of beasts and horns, and little kings that speak with great pride. He wrote also of a time when that pride would be broken, when dominion given to one like the Son of Man would be true and everlasting. Not once did he boast that he had seen the full meaning of these things. Rather, he closed some scrolls and sealed them, that they might rest until the appointed time. To the humble who asked him for more, he would say, "Wait upon the Lord, watch with prayer, be found doing justice and loving mercy while you wait." The faithfulness of Daniel impressed itself upon those who watched him.
Some said he was a wonder because he could read a heavenly scroll. Others said he was mad for his constant petitions. Yet others called him the father of wisdom in their courts. He would answer none of these titles. He sought only to be accounted a servant who feared God. His hope was not in praise of men, nor in the comfort of honors, but in the sure promise that God would set to rights all things in his due time. There came, as all seasons bring, a closing of days. He felt the weakness of the flesh and the shortening of breath, yet his spirit remained keen as a sentinel's eye. He walked once more to the window that looked toward the old city, and he remembered the songs of his youth. He remembered the language of his fathers and the lamps on festival nights. He remembered the prayer of a nation kneeling with humility, and he lifted his voice in thanksgiving that he had been allowed to witness even a portion of the counsel of God. Before he lay aside his pen, he gave charge to those who would keep the scrolls. He said, "Keep these words safe. Give them not to those who would tangle them with their own hopes. Preserve them in faith until the time of the end. Speak plainly to the people what is plain, and guard the mysteries with reverence." To the governors he said, "Rule with an eye to justice. Do not lift your hand for unrighteous gain. Be merciful to the stranger and to the weak." To the young he said, "Seek wisdom. Set your feet upon prayer. Let integrity be the lamp before you." When the last of his instructions were given, he sought once more the shelter of prayer. He opened his hands and turned his face toward the heavens. He remembered the visions that had frightened his nights and brightened his days. He remembered the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, and he entrusted all that he had seen to the Lord who alone governs the times. Thus, Daniel's life came to be known among the peoples, a life of reproof and consolation, of firmness and supplication, of insight kept in humility. His writings endured, their edges worn by the hands that read them in times of trial. In later years, men would call him blessed for his faithfulness, and the children of those who read his words would find courage in the midst of exile and in the courts of strange kings. The lamp by his window did not go out like a flame snuffed by wind. It burned down to its socket, watched by the steady breath of a man who had learned to be patient under the hand of God. Outside, the city rolled on in its small cares. Inside, a peace rested like dew. Daniel closed his eyes in the hush, and the nations continued to turn beneath the governance he had seen in vision. Some rising, some falling, all kept within the sweep of the Lord's purpose. Readers who stand where he stood are summoned to the same tasks he held: to pray without ceasing, to hold truth without forcing its hour, to act justly and love mercy in their place.
Let those who esteemed by the glory of power remember the vision of the Ancient of Days. Let those who are weary in waiting take comfort in the promise that the Lord will make an end in righteousness. Above the noise of empires, the prophet's counsel remains simple and grave. Be faithful, be humble, be patient. Now the night keeps watch over the plain, and the lamp at the window is a small witness. The scrolls are rolled and sealed. The words that were given remain, like planted seed awaiting harvest. And the faithful who read them, those who hunger for light and who stand against the seductions of dominance, will find in Daniel's life a map for walking through strange courts, a pattern for prayer, and a hope that does not disappoint. And the scrolls went forth from the chamber where Daniel had laid them, borne in the hands of those he had charged. They went not as trophies, but as trust. Wrapped in linen, carried under the watch of the faithful, they passed from house to house, from town to town, until at last they rested where the people met to remember their laws and their longing. There arose among the elders a careful keeping. At the gate of the city, where men and women came to seek judgment and counsel, a small house of study was set apart. There the scrolls were unrolled before lamp and plane, and the words were read aloud. Old men who had seen exile lean on their staffs and listen. Youths sat silent and drank the telling, as one drinks cool water in a weary land. Mothers folded their hands and remembered the prayers their fathers had taught them. The book of visions was not hid from the people, yet it was opened with awe, for many of its sayings were dark, and many of its images were great. Scribes sat in the house and held the letters with steady hand. They copied each line with care, pausing oft to ask the elders the meaning of a phrase. When the ink dried, they rolled the new copies, and these copies were sent abroad to neighboring towns. Thus the words were multiplied, and their sound went on the wind as seed upon the furrowed field. Some who read them did so with trembling, others with boldness. There were those who sought to make the visions bend to their own counsel, and there were those who would not touch them save with reverent fingers. The elders would say, "Keep them plain, and speak plainly. Mix not the visions with the devices of men." In years of hardship, men turned to the scrolls as to a sure lamp. When an edict weighed upon a people, when altars strange were set up in their midst, the elders would bring forth Daniel's writing and read aloud of the Ancient of Days and of one like unto a son of man. At such reading, the heart of the weak was made to stand firm. A father, hearing the tale of faith preserved in furnace and den, would clasp his child's hand and say, "Be not dismayed. Remember what God hath done of old."
The speech of Daniel became a speech for distress, a voice that called the nation to patient courage and upright life. There were those also who used Daniel's example in council. Governors and judges who feared God remembered the words that Daniel had spoken to rulers. Do justice, be merciful to the stranger, set your hand against wicked gain. The counsel of such men was lighter for the reading. Their decisions bore a steadier balance. Yet among the mighty there were some who heard and were hardened. Power will sometimes love its ease more than the law. Yet even the rebukes of Daniel found hearing in some hearts, and conscience was stung as by a barbed arrow. Time multiplied seasons as waters multiply upon the face of the earth. New generations grew up who had not seen the exile, but who had the scrolls in their houses.
Boys learned to read from the words of Daniel and repeat them in the marketplaces. Girls sang fragments of the visions to the tune of household songs. Teachers took the sayings as a pattern, that one might stand before kings and yet keep the fear of God, that one might be wise and yet be humble, that one might speak plainly and leave the end with the Lord. There arose also a company of those who sought to explain the visions. They sat in the school and weighed each figure, and they taught in parables to make the hard things plain. Some found comfort in such teaching. Others chafed, craving points of exactness where the writing gave shadows and not full light. To them the elders answered, "Seek not to be puffed up by knowledge, but let knowledge lead to service. For the end of knowing is to do what is right." Among the peoples there came seasons that tried the soul, the sword, the famine, the mockery of those who did not fear the Lord. In those seasons the book of Daniel was oft carried in the garments of the afflicted. A man would take it by night and read beside his bed. A woman would weave its phrases into her prayers as she worked at the loom. When news came that some city had fallen, the people would go to the house of study and hear the words again, and their hearts would be steadied. So did the reading of Daniel both a lamp in private sorrow and a trumpet in public need. Stories grew, as stories will, about the seers and the men who kept their words. Some told that Daniel had counseled kings and averted wrath. Some told that he had seen the throne of the Most High, and that the books were closed until the appointed season. These tales did not undo the plain charge given at his last: guard what is plain, and keep the mysteries with reverence. Thus the people sought a middle way between wonder and taming of the wonder. There were also subtle perils. Where the offering of a scroll brought gain, men were tempted to clothe the sayings in richer phrases than they warranted. The elders watched such things as one watches a fire near the granary.
They would call the scribes together and remind them of Daniel's last charges. Speak plainly what is plain. Bind not the people's hope to your own devices. Those who sought to add for their own praise were rebuked. Those who kept with humility were commended. In many places the instruction took root, and the memory of Daniel's meekness became itself a standard for those who taught. And as years lengthened, foreign tongues and new customs pressed upon the people. Yet the book was a tether to their fathers. Travelers who came from afar would carry into their tents phrases of Daniel, and in distant lands the children of the exile would be found keeping the feast days and reading of the faith of those before them. Thus the counsel that had been sealed went forth as seed, and in many soils it brought forth fruit. So the generations went. In the councils of elders, beside the wells, in private houses, and upon the threshold of judgment, the voice of Daniel remained. It was not a loud voice that sought to rule the nations by might, but a steady voice that counseled sanctity of life, patience in tribulation, and trust in the ruler of times. Men of power were thereby reminded that their dominion was but for a season. The poor were given a language to lift before God. The young were taught that wisdom and prayer are better shields than a warrior's spear. And yet the end of days remained a matter of waiting. Many who read the visions did so with eager eyes, longing to know when the appointed time should come. They measured signs as sailors measure the stars. They conjectured, and sometimes strife arose over interpretation. The elders would then call the people to stillness and would remind them, "Wait upon the Lord.
Keep faith in your hearts. Do justice and love mercy. For the secrets are the Lord's, and the appointed times belong to Him who sits above the course of years. Thus the lamp at Daniel's window had ceased, but other lamps burned in houses of study and in humble dwellings, and the light passed from hand to hand. The scrolls were read in sorrow and in joy. The people were formed by their words. In all places where the faithful stood against the seductions of domination, they found in Daniel a pattern, a life unanticipated by the tongues of men, steadfast in prayer, unbent by honors, patient in waiting, and trusting in the righteous end of the Lord. In the great market, the cry of merchants rose and fell. In the courts, the judges opened their decrees. Yet beneath all these things, the quiet teaching of the scrolls endured, like a deep river under the earth. Those who would bear authority were warned by it. Those who would endure suffering were comforted by it. Thus the will of God moved in hidden ways, and the words Daniel left behind lived as instruments for shaping hearts. So it was ordained among those who loved the law and feared the Lord, that Daniel's writing should not be used as a lever of power, nor as a cloak for the ambitious.
Rather, it should be a balm to the bruised, a guide to the young, and a reprover to the proud. The faithful multiplied the words, the humble kept their bearings, and the nation, though many times sorely tried, found that its roots were not broken, for the Lord preserved testimony in the mouths of those who would not barter truth for comfort. And in a certain year, when harvest was thin, and the fields gave forth little, the elders again gathered at the house of study. They unrolled a copy, and read the words at the close of the day, and the people listened until the stars came forth. There was silence when the reading ceased, and then an old man rose. He spoke not to rebuke, nor to settle debate, but to remind them of the charge Daniel had given. Keep these words safe. Give them not to those who would tangle them with their own hopes. Preserve them in faith until the time of the end. Thus they bound themselves anew to the simple rule, to pray without ceasing, to hold truth without forcing its hour, to act justly and love mercy while they wait. And in that small vow the life of Daniel found continuation among the living, as the lamp of one man was made many lamps, kindled by a single steady fire. The city slept, the watchmen kept their rounds, and the scrolls rested once more beneath the care of those who feared the Lord. In the days that followed that oath of the elders, there arose among the people a quiet stirring, not by tumult of arms, nor by clamor of rulers, but by the soft passing of hands and the slow turning of skins. Young men, taught at the knees of those who remembered exile, set themselves to copying the scrolls. Women who kept the hours of the house taught the children to read the old letters. Craftsmen who heard the words at the market would murmur them while their fingers worked. The city knew a certain song of study, and the song made light in many homes. One among those who labored was a young scribe named Hananiah. He was slender and quick of hand, and his eyes had the restlessness of one who seeks to understand more than to be understood. From boyhood he had lingered by the house of study. His fingers had first traced the letters of Daniel under the guidance of a gray-haired teacher who still remembered the exile's roads. Hananiah loved the visions, yet he loved still more the man who had prayed by the windows. To him, the prayer that would not be silenced was the root of all counsel. Without prayer, he said at times to those who would listen, the greatest seeing is but mind's vanity. In the copying room, Hananiah learned the craft of careful script.
He learned to scrape away error, to steady the reed, to mix the glue and make the skins hold. He learned also the weight of marginal notes, why a scribe should be slow to set down a gloss that was a spark without kindling. For there were those who, in zeal, wrote upon the writ that which their hearts desired, and where such glosses spread, strife followed.
The elders charged the teachers to bind the hands of youthful zeal with wisdom. They set rules that marginal words should be marked as conjecture and not to stand as law. It happened that a caravan from beyond the sea brought tidings and a stranger into the city. He was a trader of spices and bright cloths, and with him he carried a parchment rolled and tied with a thread of blue. At the house of study he sought audience, for he had been told that men there kept the scroll of visions. When they unrolled his parchment, the elders saw letters of a guild they did not know, words of Daniel in another hand, a translation made for a distant people. Beside the translation were notes which declared plainly that the last days were near, and that a ruler in a distant land would soon set a crown upon his head and lay waste to the earth. The tape of the market ceased its sound. Men listened, women pushed aside the curtains. Some hearts were heavy, some were quickened. The elders took counsel. "Let not every rumor be a law," said one. "The Lord's time is his," said another. And the old teacher who had instructed Hananiah spoke lastly with the steadiness of age. "We will receive the parchment, and we will hear what it says. Yet we will not be hurried into speaking that which we do not know." So they read in quiet, and the words of translation were laid beside the old Hebrew, and the students compared the lines. They found in the new hand both devotion and haste, and where the translator had sought to make plain, he had often signed his own fear. Hananiah, who had sat close, felt anger rise at the thought that the scroll might be bent to stir alarm. He rose and spoke, not like a man who would rebuke, but like one who had touched something sacred. "We are keepers of what is given," he said. "If we add, we shall be judged as if we took. Let us copy the scrolls as they are, and let the people be taught to wait." The trader, whose name was Zor, answered with a voice that showed wear of roads. "In my land," he said, "they read and they act. A word can make a people rise. I thought, because your city keeps these things, that you would send counsel where counsel is needed." He did not speak with accusation, but with a yearning that had driven him from place to place. The elders looked at one another, and the older among them saw the danger of loose speech, and the grief of men who must live by every counsel that comes. "Teach the people steadiness," the head elder said. "Tell them that Daniel's visions are like a lamp behind a screen. They shed light, but not all things can be made visible at once. Let the people be guided to prayer and to works of mercy. Let not terror be their teacher." Yet not all hearts could be stilled. In the weeks that followed, tongues carried the translated parchment farther than the elders intended.
Aste quae parchment farther than the elders intended. At the well, women spoke of a king yet to come. At the quay, sailors wrestled with the meaning of horns and beasts. And in the court of a local magistrate, a man who desired favor with a passing governor read a line and took it for his own. He sought to have the scroll spoken over a gathering, and he planned to use its words to press his suit before men of office. When the elders heard of this, they sent Hananiah with a copy of the original to show how the words might be mislaid. Hananiah went and found the magistrate in his house of business. The man wore a cloak that showed his place. He had bread upon his table and tablets of accounts. "You of the study," he said, when Hananiah was shown in, "you hold the old things. Tell me then, shall I bind these lines to my cause? Will Daniel say that I am right to take from my neighbor and call it law?" Hananiah stood and looked upon him. He neither bowed in fear nor rose in anger, but his voice held the simple force of one who trusts that truth is its own guard. "Daniel counseled hearts," he said. "He saw kings and empires, and he taught that dominion is fleeting. He did not give license to the proud. If you seek to bind his words to gain what you desire, you make of prophecy a cloak for injustice." The magistrate's face showed a man's irritation. "Then the words are only for the poor and weak?" he asked. "If they cannot be used, what use are they at all?" Hananiah answered, "Words are for the ordering of souls. If the mighty bend them to their ambition, they are like a reed broken and set to carry the weight of a tower. The use of the words is to humble the proud and to lift the weak. Where men twist them to vice, they become no counsel at all." The magistrate regarded him, and for a moment the house was like the hush between two storms. Then the man's eyes softened, as if the truth had some small needle-point in him. He bade Hananiah bring copies, and in that house, though in small measure, Hananiah taught the magistrate the caution of the elders. The man listened, and when Hananiah left, he carried with him the first seed of restraint. So restraint spread not by law, but by teaching, not by force, but by quiet correction. The scrolls continued to be copied and carried. In the markets, men quoted Daniel to one another with humility. At the gates, the young were taught not to seek wonders from visions, but to build their lives upon prayer and justice. The elders rejoiced where they saw temperance, and they mourned where disorder took hold. Many nights they sat late, poring over phrases and arguing that a single wrong word could make a generation tremble. In time, there came a child to the house of study, a little girl named Miriam, whose hands were darkened by the clay of her mother's pots. She had run after traders and listened to stories by the wells. And when she learned the letters, she clung to them as a thirsty child to water. The elders smiled at her hunger and set her a seat among the others.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Desta frase é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência, e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. Thus, years grew into years. The city, though often tried, was upheld not by prowess, but by the steadying of countless small deeds. When famine came that year, when the fields yielded less, and the lamplight at many hearths was dim, the people did not turn first to conjecture. They gathered what they had. They set bread aside for the stranger. They kept watch over the weak, and at dusk they went to the house of study to hear the old words. Daniel's counsel had become a rule of life. Wait, pray, do justice, love mercy. In that turning toward one another, the city found what little it needed to endure. And thus years grew into years. The city, though often tried, was upheld not by prowess, but by the steadying of countless small deeds.
When famine came that year, when the fields yielded less, and the lamplight at many hearths was dim, the people did not turn first to conjecture. They gathered what they had. They set bread aside for the stranger. They kept watch over the weak. And at dusk they went to the house of study to hear the old words. Daniel's counsel had become a rule of life. Wait, pray, do justice, love mercy. In that turning toward one another, the city found what little it needed to endure. And there came to pass, on a night when the moon rode low, and the cold wind came from the wilderness, that Hananiah and Miriam sat by a small brazier and copied a renewed roll. They wrote slowly, not from haste, but from reverence. And as their hands moved, a sense of ordaining seemed to hover over them. The elder at the doorway watched and said softly, "So are lamps made many, so are watchmen multiplied." Hananiah, laying down his reed, looked toward the elder and answered, "If the lamp is kept in many hands, the darkness is not absolute." The elder nodded, and without more, they bent again to their labor. For the keeping of the words is a labor that admits of no end, and the night, like the years, would require another day's tending. The scrolls lay ready to go forth. The city slept, and the watchmen kept their rounds as the words of Daniel passed from lip to lip and from hand to hand, bearing their steady light into days yet to come.